Wonderful. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. My background is aviation psychology and human performance, and I'm coming from University of Tromsø in northern Norway, where I'm a program leader for a Master in Aviation Science, and we are based in Tromsø. Tromsø is located in the Arctic, just north from the Arctic Circle, and in winter we experience almost 2 months without daylight. And in summer, the sun never sets. We call it the midnight sun. So circadian rhythm and fatigue are not academic topics for us. They are part of everyday operational reality. And what I would like to do in the next 45 minutes is slightly shift the lens through which we look at fatigue, but not away from the regulation, not away from the flight time limitations, but maybe go a little bit deeper into human performance. Because fatigue is not just a scheduling issue. It's not only about duty hours. Fatigue, as Christian have mentioned earlier on, is a neurophysiological state that changes how we think, how we process information, how we adapt under pressure. And if we want to strengthen fatigue and fatigue risk management, we need to understand what fatigue does to cognition and behavior, and not only what duty time looks on paper. Before we talk about fatigue, I prepare a quick anonymous reflection. If you can scan the QR code, there are 6 short questions about your recent sleep, and it's in operational context. Here are the questions, but here is the QR code even bigger for you. Thank you. We can scan and I'll continue. Fantastic. Okay, I'll continue. So cross fingers, some of you managed. We'll talk about it in a few slides. Here is a picture from the northern Norway. This is taken 2 weeks ago, about Bardufoss, where is our ATO. As you see, beautiful aurora borealis. So most fatigue regulation, quite understandably, focuses on exposure. How long was the duty hour? How many sectors? Was the rest period compliant? And obviously this has been a major improvement in aviation safety. But scientific research consistently shows something important. Fatigue does not impair performance in a simple linear way. It doesn't suddenly switch from safe to unsafe. Instead, it reduces something I call cognitive margin. And what is cognitive margin? It is the buffer between task demand and available mental capacity. So under fatigue, that buffer shrinks. And now here's the crucial part. A fatigue crew can often perform routine operation perfectly well. Where vulnerability appears is not during stable or predictable parts or phases. It appears when reduced cognitive capacity meets increased task demand. And that is performance variability. And that is where fatigue risk truly resides, where it concentrates. So when we look at scientific literature, particularly sleep restriction studies, we see very consistent findings. Fatigue doesn't erase training, it doesn't eliminate procedural competence. Pilots do not suddenly forget how to fly. What fatigue impairs first are the higher order regulatory functions. So sustained attention becomes unstable, working memory becomes narrower, executive control, by that I mean planning, revising decision, and also inhibiting impulses, all that becomes much slower. And this is very important because early fatigue does not look like incompetence. It looks like reduced flexibility. So when you fatigue, you can still execute a checklist, but adapting when something unexpected happens, that becomes more cognitively expensive. So research shows that under chronic partial sleep restriction, people underestimate their impairment. They're subject to fatigue stabilizes, but objective performance continues to decline. So the danger is not dramatic collapse, the danger is subtle performance variability. And that variability becomes operationally relevant when task demand is increased. So one of the influential studies in sleep science examined what happens when individuals sleep 6 hours per night for 2 weeks. So it's not extreme sleep deprivation, that's not 48 hours awake, just moderate restrictions. And from this study, after 14 days, cognitive performance was equivalent to being awake for 48 continuous hours. And here's the critical part. Participants did not feel dramatically worse. Their subjective fatigue has stabilized. Their objective performance continued to decline. This is known as the illusion of adaptation. So we think we adjusted, but cognitively we haven't. So for fatigue risk management, this is highly relevant because self-report alone cannot detect cumulative degradation. Fatigue risk does not always announce itself. It just quietly reduces the cognitive bandwidth. So before the slide, I ask you a few questions about sleep pattern and fatigue perception. Let's have a very quick, brief look at the responses in the room. I have my computer here. If somebody responded, we'll see that. I'm curious if we are all very rested. Okay, ooh, there is quite a few. That's nice to see. Let me see if we can see that. Okay, I cannot share it with you now, but I can put it as a document, and the document that will be shared with you, with all the presentations. And there's only one person that had less than 5 hours. 5 to 6 hours, 18 people, 13%. 6, 7 hours, 52%. Oops. I don't know what's happening, is it okay? Okay. So 6 to 7 hours, most of you. So I think most of us here are pretty fine. However, I can see that 14% do sleep less than 6 hours. And over a period of past 2 weeks, there will be some people that definitely are chronically fatigued. Circadian time exposure, I ask about that. None of the above, most of you, so we have some that had some 3 early starts, minimum, night operation, 10% of you cross time zones. So most of us are fine. However, there are some of you that definitely should maybe reconsider how you operate. Even that maybe not all of you are flying, but the exposure to fatigue is definitely higher. And what do you feel when operating under fatigue? Which domain feels most affected? Wonderful. The decision speed, most of you identified that as number 1, very much agree. Communication energy, 44%. Excellent. Monitoring stability, 21%. And task prioritization, 34%. Okay, that will kind of come together as we talked further. And the last question under the cumulative sleep restriction, how accurately do you believe you can detect subtle changes in your own cognition? And there are some brave people, moderately accurately, excellent, 52%. That's nice to know. I'm curious what you say after finishing the presentation. Some of you think with difficulty and very accurately 11 people. Wow. Excellent. We'll share this with you. Super. Thank you so much. Next slide. So fatigue is not just about how long we work. It is also about when we work. So human alertness follows a biological rhythm. It's regulated by circadian processes. So between approximately 2 to 6 in the morning, performance naturally dips, even if you're well rested. Reaction time slows. attention lapses increases, working memory effectively declines. So now when you combine that with reduced sleep opportunity or time zone transition, as some of you have experienced, this impairment will multiply. This means that two identical duty periods can produce very different cognitive risk profiles. So if you have a 9-hour duty beginning at 10 a.m., that will not be cognitively equivalent to 9-hour duty beginning at 3 a.m. So exposure is the same. However, the cognitive vulnerability is not. So imagine a crew reporting at 4:45 for a 6 a.m. departure. They woke up around 3:30. Biologically, their brain still thinks it's night. And during taxi, ATC gives complex taxi clearance. The first officer pauses slightly longer before he responds. This is nothing unsafe. But what we can see is the decision latency that you have already identified. That's like the number one for many of you. And this is one of the earliest signs of fatigue signals or reduced cognitive margin. And this is an important nuance. If fatigue always produces immediate operational failure, aviation would not function, as well as many other high-risk industries. Many flights conducted under fatigue are completely safe. Obviously, you can imagine why. Because routine operations under stable condition may not exceed the available cognitive capacity. So fatigue reduces margin, but if task demand remains predictable, the reduced margin may still be sufficient. So risk concentrate when variability increases. So and that could be unexpected rerouting, weather deterioration, automation reversion, late runway change. Now the system actually demands cognitive flexibility. And under fatigue, executive controls, so it's slower. So fatigue is not a binary state of, whether it's safe or unsafe. It is a condition that reduces adaptive capacity. And aviation safety depends on adaptation. So in TEM terms, or the threat and error management, fatigue is already classified as a threat. But we rarely analyze how it narrows cognitive margin before an error occurs. So consider a crew on their fourth sector on a day, near the end, long duty period. During descent, ATC suddenly changed the arrival runway and gives a new star. So both pilots now have to reprogram the FMC, verify constraints, communicate with ATC, and monitor the aircraft. So the procedure is routine, but because fatigue has reduced cognitive margin, the same task now requires more effort. I'm not saying it's unsafe, it just requires more effort. Following the MAX accidents, the structured threat and error management gained a renewed emphasis. Many operators now use briefing tools such as STEM cards to explicitly identify anticipated threats before flights. So within that framework, fatigue is already recognized as an internal threat, particularly during early starts, night duties, and high workload sequences. However, identifying fatigue as a threat is not the same as understanding how it modifies performance. So fatigue rarely produces immediate procedure failure. It reduces cognitive margin, the flexibility, and also reduces the adaptive bandwidth we have to make decision revision and have a certain speed. So under increased task demand, that reduced margin increases the probability of error. So the oversight opportunity is therefore not just to confirm that fatigue was identified, but to ask whether behavioral drift is being monitored with existing TEM structures. So unlike the weather terrain, fatigue modifies the crew's ability to manage other threats. And don't forget about that in fatigue or in accident investigation, fatigue is very rarely listed as the primary cause. It usually appears as a contributory factor, not because it's unimportant, but because fatigue does not directly create an event. It reduces the cognitive margin that allows humans to manage the threats. So like in Colgan Air accident, when fatigue was identified as contributory factor, even if we think it's a large contributor, obviously it's one of the fatigue accidents, but the contributory factor was the affecting crew performance. So while the immediately cause was incorrect stall response. So I would like to introduce a simple conceptual model. Under normal conditions, humans operate with the buffer between cognitive capacity and task demand, and that buffer is what I refer as cognitive margin, as we mentioned earlier. It allows flexibility, decision revision, and allows minor recovery from minor deviations. So fatigue reduces the available cognitive capacity. I'm saying it so many times. At the end of the day, it will be just a sentence, easy to say. It's not dramatic at first, but it's but measurably. But when task demand increases, for example, during abnormal events or time pressure, the reduced margin becomes operationally significant. So risk is not simply fatigue. Risk is the interaction between reduced capacity and increased demand. That is why fatigue-related performance variability often appears during transitions, not during cruise. In addition to experimental research, operational data streams show recurring performance variability patterns. Across 10 operational months for safety reporting and FTM summaries from airline X, we see stable reporting engagement and recurrent events families, particularly approach stability and speed management. The majority of events are minor or major. Critical events remain rare. And this is important. Fatigue rarely produces catastrophe directly. It produces variability. And that variability is visible in structured SMS and FDM outputs. So this is not a proof that fatigue caused these events. It demonstrates where reduced cognitive margin becomes operationally visible. What we are observing here are concentration patterns. On the left, variability clustered in specific events families, approach stability, energy management, monitoring related deviations. And these are phases characterized by high cognitive demand. They require rapid information integration, stable vigilance, and flexible decision revision. On the right, we see temporal distribution across local time windows. These are clustering during early morning and circadian low periods. Again, this is not causal attribution, but it is consistent with what sleep science tells us. Fatigue reduces executive control, slows decision revision, and increases vigilance instability. So when physiological vulnerability overlaps with high task demand, variability becomes more likely to surface. The biology itself is invisible. The variability is what becomes measurable. And this is why fatigue risk management should not only ask how long did somebody work, but also where does the performance variability cluster. Did I? Some of my early research examined how flight time limitation schemes protect pilots from fatigue across different operational contexts. Specifically, I compared short-haul and medium-haul duty structures, looking at how sector frequency, duty time, and circadian disruption influence fatigue exposure. The analysis focused on how regulatory framework attempts to control fatigue through duty limits, rest requirement, and cumulative limits. What became interesting is that these frameworks regulate exposure to fatigue, but exposure alone does not fully explain how fatigue appears in operational performance. In other words, two crew may operate within the same legal duty limits, but experience very different cognitive conditions depending on circadian timing, workload, and operational complexity. On this slide, we see a simplified comparison between short-haul and medium-haul operation under the same FLT framework. At first glance, medium-haul duties may appear more fatiguing because the duty periods are longer. However, short-haul operations often involve multiple sectors, repeated takeoffs and landings, and constant task switching. And this creates a very different type of fatigue exposure. So short-haul fatigue is often operationally dense, many workload phases within a shorter period. Medium-haul fatigue tends to be cumulative and circadian, driven by longer duty periods and time of day. So what this comparison highlights is an important point of fatigue risk management. Fatigue risk is not only about duty length, it's about how workload is distributed within the duty. Short flight time limitations are crucial safety layers in aviation. They provide baseline protection by regulating duty time, ensuring minimum rest, limiting cumulative exposure to fatigue. We talked about that in the first day at length. These protections are essential and they work well at controlling fatigue exposure at the regulatory level. However, operational performance depends on more than exposure alone. Two crew may operate within identical duty limits, but experience very different cognitive condition during the flight. What FTL cannot fully capture are factors such as circadian misalignment, variation in task demand during operation, and complexity of real operation environment. So fatigue first appears not as immediate failure, but as a reduction in cognitive margin, the reserve capacity that allows pilot to manage unexpected events. So this is why exposure limits alone cannot fully explain performance variability in operational setting. And to understand this better, we need to briefly look at what fatigue actually does to the brain. One of the challenges in fatigue oversight is that fatigue rarely presents as dramatic non-compliance, yeah? It does not usually appear as reckless behavior. It appears as behavioral drift. Communication becomes slower, monitoring becomes slightly less stable, decision revision takes longer, or sometimes decisions are closed prematurely to reduce cognitive effort. So you may see increased checklist repetition, you may see reduced verbalization between crew members. And these are not violations, these are just subtle shift in adaptive flexibility. And importantly, these behaviors are often already visible in line observation and simulator assessments. They're simply not always interpreted through a fatigue lens. So performance collapse is a late-stage fatigue, while behavioral variability is early-stage fatigue. Let me put it this way. So behavioral variability is an early-stage fatigue. Performance collapse is a late-stage fatigue. If fatigue reduces cognitive flexibility rather than competence, then we should expect its effect to appear within existing competency domains. So as we said, communication may become less proactive, workload management may shift from anticipatory to reactive, decision may become slower, and also situational awareness doesn't disappear, but definitely narrows. And this, I guess, is important, because inspectors and operators are already evaluating these competencies. Fatigue does not require a completely new measurement system. It requires integrating a fatigue-aware interpretation into existing competency observation. In other words, fatigue risk may already be visible. We simply need to recognize the pattern. And for many years, aviation safety focused on preventing failure, identifying error, removing the cause, strengthening barriers. Yeah, it is essential and it works. But modern system thinking produces another perspective, the safety too, and that is not only the absence of failure, it is the ability to sustain adaptive performance under varying conditions. So fatigue is interesting in this context because it does not usually create immediate failure. It reduces adaptive capacity again and again. And when this adaptive capacity decreases, the performance variability increases, and that variability, not necessarily the accident, becomes the early signal. So from the system perspective, fatigue is not simply an individual weakness. It is a condition that reduces system resilience. and resilience depends on cognitive flexibility. One of the most important practical points is this. So fatigue risk is rarely invisible. It's already present in safety data. Line observation may show subtle variability in communication and monitoring. Simulating grading may reveal slower decision revision during early morning checks. FDM analysis may show clustering of unstable approaches by time of day. So the signals may already be there, but it may not be explicitly interpreted as fatigue related. And it's not a criticism, it's just a matter of analytical framing. If fatigue primarily reduces cognitive margin, then its effect will appear as variability, not necessarily as violation. And SMS systems are already designed to detect variability. So flight time limitation provide essential baseline. They manage exposure, reduce extreme risk. But exposure control alone cannot guarantee cognitive fitness. Oversight can involve, not by replacing compliance, but by complementing it. So by asking additional questions. Do we see time of day clustering and performance variability? Do abnormal events outcome differ during circadian load operations? Are behavioral fatigue signals discussed during audits? Are operators analyzing adaptive performance under reduced margin? And this is not about adding more bureaucracy, it's about recognizing that fatigue risk is context dependent. And context dependent risk requires performance-aware oversight. So if we understand fatigue as reduced cognitive bandwidth, then oversight should consider not only how long crew work, but how the system performs when cognitive margin narrows. And we know fatigue is inevitable in 24-hour aviation. We heard it a few times yesterday. We cannot eliminate it. So the question becomes, how do we design systems that function when cognitive margin narrows? In fatigue risk management review, this means analyzing performance variability, not only roster legality. As we said, do event cluster change by time of day? Or is behavioral drift visible in current reporting? So in training design, this means testing adaptive capacity, not only procedural compliance. For example, in simulator session, do we observe how crew revise decision under time compression? Do we deliberately introduce automation degradation in early morning scenarios? And the same in debriefing. Fatigue should be discussed as variability in competencies, not as a weakness, and not only as a rule violations. If we accept that fatigue reduces cognitive margin rather than eliminating competence, then its effect should be visible within existing competency framework. The ICAO model already defines 9 core competencies for flight crew performance, and the question becomes, where would fatigue-related variability appear? So for example, in communication, actually going to next slide, maybe that's going to be a bit nicer. So fatigue requires interpreting variability within existing competencies through a fatigue-aware lens. Inspectors and operators are already measuring these behaviors. Fatigue sensitivity may lie in recognizing the pattern. In other words, fatigue is often measurable indirectly through performance variability. I meant this slide. So here I'm focusing on a cognitive and CRM-related competencies. So if fatigue reduces cognitive margin, meaning available adaptive bandwidth, we should expect its expression to appear in domains that depend on executive control and flexibility. So we started with communication. The changes is usually subtle. we don't use incorrect phraseology, but reduce proactive exchange. It is less anticipatory. In decision-making, what we often see is slower plan revision. It takes longer to integrate new information and adjust strategy. When it comes to situational awareness, that may narrow. It doesn't collapse, but it's much narrower. And primary cues tends to be maintained, but secondary cues are more easily missed. And workload management may shift from anticipatory to reactive. Leadership and teamwork can become slightly more rigid and less assertive under high workload. So these are not failures of competence, these are reductions in adaptive flexibility. And that distinction matters. On the other side, there are most technical domains. So on this technical side, fatigue expressions are often even more nuanced. Procedural knowledge remains intact, however, we may observe increased checklist rereading. This is not incompetence, this is cognitive compensation. So in automation management, monitoring instability can increase. Intervention during unexpected mode changes may be slightly delayed. So manual aircraft control can remain stable under routine condition, but precision may degrade under high cognitive load. Also, when it comes to knowledge, it doesn't disappear, but retrieval speed under pressure may slow. Again, these are not training deficiencies, these are manifestations of reduced cognitive bandwidth. And importantly, these behaviors are already observable within simulator grading, line checks, operational monitoring. So fatigue influences the expression of competencies, not the existence of competencies. So this leads to fundamental questions. Are we managing fatigue risk or managing compliance? Compliance is essential. It protects against extreme exposure. It reduces acute risk, very important. But compliance controls exposure. So exposure does not equal performance variability. A crew can be fully legal, fully compliant, and still operate with reduced cognitive margin, especially during circadian low, under time pressure, during automation degradation. So if fatigue reduces adaptive bandwidth before competence fail, then fatigue risk management must detect behavioral patterns, not only hours of duty. So this is not about replacing compliance, it's about complementing it with performance-aware oversight. To conclude practically, flight time limitation remain foundational. They prevent extreme exposure. But performance-informed fatigue management adds another layer. Authorities and operators might ask, where do we see clustering of variability? Do unstable approaches concentrate at certain circadian phases? Do simulator assessments show differences in early morning sessions? Are behavioral fatigue signals discussed during audits? Is fatigue framed only as a scheduling issue or also as a coping capacity issue? This is not about increasing regulatory burden, it's about analytical refinement. We are not replacing compliance, we are strengthening it with performance insight. So let me close with 3 simple ideas. Fatigue is not primarily about very motivated or disciplined. It's biological limitation of the brain. Second, fatigue rarely removes competence. Pilots remain skilled and capable, but fatigue reduces the cognitive margin that allows them to manage unexpected situations. And third, operational risk rarely comes from fatigue alone. It emerges when reduced cognitive capacity meets increased task demand. So aviation safety therefore depends on sustaining adaptive performance and the variability. And fatigue reduces the margin available for that adaptation. So we will never eliminate fatigue from aviation, but we can design systems that remain resilient when cognitive bandwidth narrows. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. So we'll Do we have questions, Clint? So we only have one question so far. There we go. So the first question we have is, during abnormal events when fatigued, do you give any credit to the adrenaline effect?
Very interesting questions indeed. We did not look at adrenaline effect, to be honest, but I think crew already operate under some adrenaline in a normal operation as well. So it's interesting, definitely, to consider, but we did not look into that.
Interesting. Cool. Are there any others coming through the stage now? No. Anybody in the room while we're here? Oh, I'll come down. Oh, I can do it. It's fine.
Hello, Carsten Reuter from Germany. How would you promote the impact of substances like melatonin as a accepted means to mitigate fatigue?
You're talking about substance abuse?
Like melatonin.
Like melatonin?
Yeah, similar.
Well, circadian rhythm definitely is problematic in this case. So we do need to look into, consider how circadian rhythm disruption does affect your performance, and obviously it does. I mean, we're talking about it at length, not just in my presentation, but previous ones. It really depends. It is quite individual at the end of the day, so it depends what we're talking about. But generally, it's definitely something to consider and look into. But if you have somebody who is sleep deprived or affected by circadian rhythm, as I tried to show with competency-based training or competence in the 9 competencies, you will see a variation, obviously, in their performance. So whether it is circadian rhythm disruption or something else, that is something that you have to go into deeper with the person itself.
Cool, thank you so much. So we've got some more questions now. So the next one, if performance variability becomes the signal, do you have suggestions on how to get these plugged in the fatigue reporting cycle?
For me, as I talked about the 9 competencies, I think that's a perfect way to look at what kind of competencies are degrading. So for each and every one, I mean, we see a direction, we see where it goes, but for individual one, you really have to look into it and see what are the reasons for it.
And I guess it's something that would take some discussion if it was happening on a particular flight. Is then discussion between the crew to kind of recognise that and then feel confident enough to report that and consider what it means in the organisation.
True, but that's the point of the data, isn't it? I mean, we've seen some presentation with We Love Data. If you look into the data, that's what I would say, we already see it within the data. It's just analysing it and looking at them right way.
So we move on to the next one. FTL limits duty exposure, but cumulative fatigue relates strongly to sleep regularity. As SRI isn't reflected in FTL, could it support fatigue assessments?
I'm not sure I understand the question. How do you try to stress from fatigue?
Matthias is here. No, he's not. He's online, isn't he? Oh, sorry. Okay, we'll move on. How do you differentiate stress from fatigue? Yeah.
Interesting.
We had that yesterday.
Interesting question as well. So, again, when you look at if you have 2 people flying, there is lots of things that you can you can do to look into why they're fatigued or why they're stressed. So in our research, we did not looked into it deeper, but generally they are kind of interlinked either way. So you can be stressed and fatigued. You can be fatigued and stressed.
The next one, how does experience influence the bandwidth?
Experience of what?
I guess cumulative experience, I'm assuming here, cumulative flying experience as an individual over time.
Obviously, if you're fatigued, you will have reduced cognitive bandwidth. So
Doesn't necessarily change over time as you get more experience through your career.
well, we talked about age and fatigue as well. So indeed, when you are older, biologically you do actually degrade. So your sleep is different, your sleep pattern change. However, older people tend to compensate with experience. So you already know what works for you, what doesn't. So the experience kicks in. Again, it's very individual, but yeah, there is a difference, obviously.
And we had that discussion actually yesterday, I remember, in one of the questions about, as you get older and that kind of thing. So interesting. Why didn't you consider cabin crews?
It's purely the accessibility. So right now we work only with pilots, but definitely that will be the next step, our obvious step.
We know just a man in Norway to help you if you need that. How can you assess performance variability within operations?
Well, as we were talking in the presentation as well, you already have lots of data to look at it. So SMS, flight data monitoring, many of you do LOSA, so you can actually see the variability.
Yes, that's how the organisation uses that data.
Exactly. So it's not like introducing anything new. It's just looking at what you have and looking at it through a different lens.
And using it, to make different decisions.
When we started to work with CBTA, then we realized that you can actually look at this from a different angle and use it for fatigue as well, because there is obvious degradation in performance due to fatigue, and it's kind of nicely visible in that. So it's purely to look at the data from a different point of view.
That makes sense. Do you measure the use of control graphs?
Not
in this study, in that context, no. Okay, cool. Should you recommend to introduce an additional fatigue observation during assessment in the 9 ICAO competencies during training or supervision?
Well, this is an interesting one, because we have a lot of conversation with my colleagues as well, that some people are very for the 9 competencies and they see the value, and some don't. And it also depends what kind of operation you're running. So we have some guys that we work with from the military as well, and they see the competency-based training and the 9 competencies is very valuable. Some do not see the same thing. I think introducing another one could be very problematic. So I think we should work with what we have currently. So you can already see what it's
there already.
Yeah. But it really depends. I mean, so many people, I'm sure even for you that work with CBTA, you probably have an opinion about it. And I hear lots of difficulties when interpreting not the data, but the use and how you use it in simulators as well. So I can imagine that introducing a new part would be problematic. So I would not do that.
And interestingly, we've done 6 webinars on EBT and CBTA
and now
implementation.
We're introducing another one.
We know the challenges in that, so it might make that even more complicated. You mentioned these patterns are already in the data. Can you describe the most useful data sources to detect performance variability?
I think we were talking about it here. In the 9 competencies, you can see it in the decision-making. Already at the start, most of you have identified or slower decision-making as the number 1. So that's kind of small problems are creeping in. So decision-making, narrowed situation awareness, then workflow management start to be also slower, and maybe more errors are creeping in. So I would just go through the competencies as a good indicator of where problems may arise.
And it's interesting, this is kind of follows on to certainly an area that's been, this sounds really sad, kind of a big passion of mine, because I'm a sad taxonomy geek. Having done a lot of reporting systems, and particularly within ECARES, we evolved the ADREP 2000 taxonomy from, some of you might have used it in the past, where it had event types, explanatory factors, descriptive factors, explanatory and descriptive factor modifiers, and it was about 17 attributes and a complete nightmare. So we shoehorned all of that with a bunch of psychologists and operational staff, and we put all of that into 4 levels of event types only, with all of the actual events at level 4, specifically to make the development of performance indicators easy. But particularly in that context, we integrated HFACs and Boeing MEDA and some other human factors type decision aids to better capture in reporting systems, also things like decision making and all sorts of other human factors attributes. And certainly in the analysis we do, that those attributes are very seldom used, and I don't know, certainly many organisations that I've seen, we're very good at using taxonomies to capture basic things. The what happened, there was an unstable approach or whatever it is, but then all of the other things, and then we can't cross-refer to those kind of competency data and those things. So I think that's an interesting one. We'll take one. Oh, sorry, I heard a noise in my ear. It was over there. Excellent. So we take the last one. How do you convince an operator that they need to apply improved oversight in fatigue risk management that may assert their operation doesn't need to? Oh, so the operator thinks they don't need to do anything, but yeah.
Well, it's a tricky question, isn't it? It really depends which airlines you're talking about. But again, we're not introducing anything new. We're just saying that there is a possibility to look at fatigue from a different angle and maybe look at the stuff that is already being done and just do it better. So I know it's very difficult to convince an operator to do something that costs money. This should not. Yes, resources, but I'm always thinking about my students are all pilots, and for their final thesis, we always encourage them to ask within the company what needs to be done, that they can actually analyze the data. So we maybe encourage also your own guys, maybe somebody's doing their master or PhD, and then use them for analysis of this data.
That makes sense. And actually, that question particularly kind of feeds into quite a bit of some of what we're going to talk about this afternoon, in the sense that one of the things, as what I might call myself as not a fatigue expert, but somewhat of an outsider in this context, with no particular skin in the game in that sense, as largely now a communications person. But one of my favourite books is the book Factfulness by Professor Hans Rosling. Some of you may or may not have read it. One of the things he talks about, particularly in that book, is that quite often we talk about the world as either one thing or another, whether it's good or bad, red or green, whatever it is, or particularly in the context of discussions about fatigue, it's either one thing, very, very challenging and things that can be done, or very, very challenging at the other ends and things that cannot be done. And as we will potentially, hopefully, explore this afternoon, is how do we use reporting systems and those kind of things to gather information and feedback, but then how do we occupy the great middle ground between one thing and another to then continually, proactively, and particularly as you talk about, there's the challenge of we need to do something but it costs money, and there's we need to do it but it costs money, and like the two things are mutually exclusive almost, and they become almost like a polarised debate, rather than there's a whole ton of grey in the middle, and how do we talk about the difficult bits to actually make that kind of turn into reality.
You definitely have to make a good cause for it, that's for sure. But if you come with the idea that it does not cost money, you're more likely to be, I guess, and I guess everybody here are passionate about fatigue risk management, so that is already a good start. So it's easier to appeal with something that you already feel motivated to do.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, and have a wonderful...